Hey everyone, we are going to read chapters 25 and 26 in Dolls of War today. So remember, the last thing Mrs. Farrell had said to Macy was, "Shall we use the special blanket you brought with you to separate you and your dad in your room?" No! Macy would have clutched the blanket and Miss T close, but they were upstairs under the bed. It's not big enough. It's not? Mrs. Farrell's eyebrows rose. It looked hefty when you carried it in. Macy stood as if frozen while thoughts rushed through her head, none of them answers for Mrs. Farrell. At any moment, Mr. Farrell would demand to see the blanket and everything would be ruined. Why hadn't she thought to hide the doll in the museum, maybe in the sarcophagus with the mummy? But the lid was so heavy, and the mummy would be dusty. She saw Mrs. Farrell's expression become gentle. "I understand," the woman said. "The blanket is a bit of home. You want it warm beneath your cheek, not hanging out in the cold." Macy nodded, daring to hope her secret would still be safe. "You're exhausted, poor child." Mrs. Farrell patted Macy's shoulder. "The bathroom is off the kitchen. I've left a clean washcloth beside the basin and a toothbrush in case you forgot to bring one. Go ahead and wash up. I'll have an extra blanket hung up for a curtain by the time you're ready to climb into bed." Macy hurried through her preparations, then rushed up the stairs. Relief made her knees wobble when she saw that Mrs. Farrell was just finishing pinning a pink cotton blanket to a clothesline stretched from the middle of the window to the middle of the upper door frame. "We each have our own little room now," Macy said, and impulsively hugged the woman. "Thank you, Mrs. Farrell." Mrs. Farrell hugged her back. "You're very welcome, dear. Say your prayers and hop into bed. You'll be starting school tomorrow, so that will be another busy day for you." Once into her nightgown and alone upstairs, Macy scrambled across her bed and peered into the dark crack next to the wall. "Good night," she whispered. "Don't worry, Miss T. I'll keep you safe. I promise." Papa came up the stairs a little later. Macy called a soft good night as the bed springs beyond the hanging blanket squeaked beneath his weight. Rain drumming on the roof lulled her to sleep far more quickly than she expected. She woke early, sitting straight up, calling, "Mama!" It took a moment to realize she had been dreaming. In the dream, Mama was trapped under her wheelchair and calling for her. That was dumb. Mama was safe in heaven. She wasn't trapped and she didn't need the wheelchair anymore. Even so, Macy slid closer to the wall and slipped her hand down to feel the familiar bulk of the Japanese doll wrapped in the blanket. "Mama's safe, Miss T. We just have to get used to this new place." From the doorway, Mrs. Farrell said, "Do you have an imaginary friend, dear? Someone named Misty?" Macy squirmed upright. "No, I don't." She trailed off. Mrs. Farrell hadn't guessed about the doll. Wasn't it better for her to think there was an invisible playmate, even though that was something a younger girl would have? Mrs. Farrell smiled. "Misty is more of a name for a puppy, but I suppose since she's invisible, it doesn't matter what your friend is called." Macy looked toward the other bed. The curtain between them was pulled back to the window, and the blankets were folded neatly at the foot. A dream-like memory came back to her of Papa coming in very early to kiss her forehead and say goodbye. He'd said something else. She frowned, thinking hard. That he would be in touch? That was it. He'd left her with a promise, one she would cling to. "Your Papa wanted you to rest this morning," Mrs. Farrell said, "but we'll need to get you into school before the first bell rings. Mr. Farrell will drive you over on his way to work. Breakfast is waiting downstairs." Macy mentally winced at the thought of a new school, a school where she was expected to start over and never talk about Miss Tokyo. "Papa can drive me." "He left at daybreak, dear. He wanted to get an early start back to the valley. Do you need help with your clothes?" "No, I'll be right down." She heard more in her voice, and based on the worried furrow over Mrs. Farrell's eyes, she'd heard it too, a silent wail. "I'm left here with people I don't know. When will Papa come back for me?" Why hadn't she asked him? But she'd been so sleepy she barely remembered his telling her goodbye. "We all have to do our part for the war." She remembered Miss Rasmussen saying that before she left to join the WAACS. "My part is to keep Miss Tokyo safe for the kids who will visit her in the museum someday," Macy decided, "and that means staying here for now." As Mrs. Farrell walked down the stairs, Macy pulled the journal from under her pillow. She needed to find a safe place to keep it. For now, in case Mrs. Farrell accidentally saw the last entries, she wrote carefully, "Dear Mama, it's nice to be at the beach again. From my bedroom, I can hear the rumble of the waves. The Farrells are very kind." After tucking the journal away, Macy slid out from under the warm patchwork quilt and padded over a thin rug to the window. She looked out on a freshly rain-washed world. To the north, A small lake gleamed blue beyond a fringe of willow trees. The double windows opened outward. When she leaned through them to look west, she could see over low trees all the way to the roofs of cottages on the rise of the dune between the highway and the sand. The beach was so near, the ocean sounded even louder. She could smell it. How soon could she explore? After school? A man came from the small cottage across the road. The collar was turned up on a long black coat that hung almost to his ankles. Despite the coat, he looked cold. When he walked along the road, Macy heard the jingle of small bells. She looked more closely. The man wore a striped knit cap with little bells tied into a tassel on the top. Old Mr. Oakes, she breathed. That's who he was, old Mr. Oakes, who wasn't careful enough with his blackout curtains. But what a funny cap for an old man. Mr. Farrell had said people were beginning to think Mr. Oakes let light gleam past his blackout curtains on purpose. She knew. She wasn't sure how, but she knew they were wrong. Old Mr. Oakes was not a traitor. He's not a spy, she said aloud, turning toward Miss Tokyo under the bed. People don't trust him, and it isn't fair. I think Mr. Oakes is a lot like me. When she slipped into place at the large table at the far end of the front room, a big bowl of crunchy cereal was already waiting. As Mrs. Farrell poured milk into the bowl, she asked, "Have you eaten puffed rice before?" Macy scooped her spoon beneath several of the puffs. Rice? Mr. Farrell, sat at the head of the table with a plate full of bacon and eggs, but his attention was on a stand nearby, in a big square box with a lot of tubes and dials. He twisted a dial past a burst of radio static as he glanced at Macy. They shoot the rice from guns to get it puffed like that. Guns? Macy looked at the rice in her bowl. How did that work? Mrs. Farrell chuckled. That's their motto. Rice shot from guns. But I doubt they mean the kind of guns our soldiers use. As I understand it, the cereal makers get the rice wet so it will steam when they heat it under pressure. When they release the pressure, the rice pops into these puffs. Like popcorn? Macy tasted the rice and decided she liked it. Do they sell it at your grocery store? The Watkins man stopped by with his van full of spices and such yesterday, Mrs. Farrell explained. Puffed rice isn't rationed, so I bought a bag. I thought it would be something special to welcome you into our family. That was nice of you, Macy said, glad she liked the puffed rice. As she raised another spoonful, she remembered to add, Thank you, Mrs. Farrell. Oh, that's so formal, Mrs. Farrell said quickly. Why don't you just call me Aunt Ida? I know we're not blood related, but we'll pretend. I'd like that, Macy said, meaning it. Maybe living here wouldn't be so awful after all. A room-shaking burst of static blared from Mr. Farrell's box. Mercy! Mrs. Farrell exclaimed. Mr. Farrell turned the dial to get past the racket. Macy couldn't help but asking, What kind of radio is that? This is called a shortwave radio, he answered. Our regular radio announcers just tell us what they think we should hear. With this, I'll hear what people all over the world are saying. All over the world? Macy marveled at the thought that voices could travel so far on radio waves, although Mr. Farrell was just getting a lot of awful noise. She had hoped to meet Mr. Oakes, but after breakfast, Mr. Farrell hustled her into his Chevrolet sedan for a ride to school. You'll be walking after today, he warned when he pulled to a stop in front of a white school with a bell tower. This is just a mile or so down the highway from the house. Not far. Macy nodded, her attention on the 2-story wood building. It didn't look like the school she was used to. Suddenly, she felt the way she had last night when Papa parked the car outside the Farrells' tall, dark house. Come along, Mr. Farrell said. You don't want to be late on your first day. Macy clutched the lunch bag Aunt Ida had handed her and hurried up the walk after him. The school office was just inside the front door. Registration went quickly, but the first bell rang before she'd finished answering questions. Mr. Farrell had gone by then, leaving her to Mrs. Johansson, a pleasant middle-aged secretary wearing a hand-crocheted sweater over her cotton dress. Once the paperwork was done, the secretary pointed her toward a 6th-grade classroom. Just go in there, dear. Your teacher's name is Miss Ross. Hand the slip to her. The empty hallway seemed to stretch longer at both ends than it had when she came in with Mr. Farrell. She wanted to run for the front door, but now it looked far away. Feeling as if moths fluttered inside her chest, she opened the classroom door Mrs. Johansson had indicated and stepped inside. Nearly a dozen students looked up from their desks. All right, chapter 26. Macy's steps sounded loud on the wood floor as she walked to the teacher and handed her the admission slip. People whispered and stared while Miss Ross read the note. The teacher rapped her desk for attention. Class, please say hello to our new student, Macy James. The entire class replied in sing-songy voices, Hello, Macy James, followed by several giggles and one spitball while Miss Ross was directing Macy to an empty desk. Worry settled like wave-washed stones in Macy's stomach. She missed Lily. She would even be glad to see Christopher Adams. A girl at the desk ahead of hers turned around. I'm Linda. She looked closely at Macy. When are you going back to your own school? Macy wondered if Linda had thrown the spitball. Not as soon as I want to. Linda grinned. Though we might as well be friends. Macy felt the coldness inside begin to ebb away as she smiled back. Guess we might as well. Linda added, I like your necklace. Macy heard pride in her voice when she answered, Thanks. My brother sent it to me. He's in the Navy. But she wouldn't tell Linda or anyone else about Miss Tokyo. A tight feeling rippling through her body warned that she had saved the doll from the neighbors in Stanby and brought her somewhere even more dangerous. No, Macy decided, Miss Tokyo is not going to be in danger because from this moment on, they'll call me the most patriotic girl in town. She leaned forward to whisper to Linda, I'm going to start a scrap drive like little orphan Annie in the funny papers. Do you want to be one of Annie's junior commandos with me? Linda swung around again. Yes, the president says we all have to do our part. We'll earn our stripes by collecting scrap, Macy said, remembering more of the president's advice. Across the aisle, a girl whispered, Can I do it too? Macy realized that whispers were going all around the room, but this time they sounded friendly. A boy a row over called, It's not just for girls, you know. Boys can collect scrap too. Miss Ross clapped her hands for silence. Class, please settle down. She nodded at Macy. A scrap drive is an excellent idea, but please make plans outside of school, not during our history lesson. The boy behind Macy tugged the back of her hair. I'm in too. Don't forget. She turned long enough to agree. Everyone's in. Everyone who wants to be. When she faced the front of the room and opened her new history book, a warm feeling spread through her. This school was going to be all right. She would make it be all right. She just wished Lily were here to help. Lifting the little silver anchor on its chain, she made sure to place it in plain sight over her blouse. Her brother was already helping her fit in with the new school. At recess, only girls gathered around Macy to plan their scrap drive. Then Linda yelled across the ball field to her brother, who was in the 7th grade, 1 year ahead of them. Vincent, I have dibs on our wagon after school. What? No. A red-haired boy charged toward Linda. He made Macy think uneasily of Mark back home. A group of Vincent's friends followed, including some Macy recognized from her 6th grade class. We're going to use it to collect scrap. So are we. Linda planted her feet solidly and nodded her hands on her hips. And I said dibs first. I thought it, Vincent yelled back. The others, Linda's friends and Vincent's, began shouting too. Macy almost expected to be shoved back and forth the way she was on that awful day when her Kokishi doll necklace was nearly ruined. Stop, she called. It's for our soldiers. Remember? Everyone fell silent. They looked at one another. Vincent said, Okay, you can use the wagon first. We'll collect more scrap than you anyway. It's not a contest, Linda said. It could be, one of the girls exclaimed. We can collect more scrap metal than any old boys. Cannot, one of the boys countered. Sure we can, a third girl said. Those boys will stop to play ball. You think so? Vincent glanced around at his friends. All right, now it is a contest. You can use the wagon first, and we'll still beat you. Miss Ross hurried toward them. What is all the shouting? She demanded. Is there a problem? No, Miss Ross, Macy said. We're just deciding how to help fight the war. She looked around at her new friends and realized she wasn't missing Lily as much as she had before. After promising to meet the group later, Macy walked from school to the Farrells' home. Mrs. Farrell approved the idea of a scrap drive, but had chores that needed to be done first. Ladies will be coming over this afternoon to roll bandages for the Red Cross. I'd like you to help. Maybe you'll have time before supper to talk to the nearest neighbors about saving their tin cans. Macy glanced across the gravel road to Mr. Oakes' small cabin, wondering how many tin cans he used and if he would save the empty ones for her. There's an old baby buggy still hanging on the wall in the garage. That should hold a lot of empty cans. Mrs. Farrell smiled and set the tea kettle on the top of the iron stove to stay hot. Half a dozen ladies soon arrived. They were all pleasant to Macy, but impatience burned inside as she rolled strips of cloth from old sheets worn soft. Every one of the ladies had already promised her empty cans to someone from school. Both boys and girls must have dashed off to ask their neighbors the moment they got home. Now, as she watched the shadows grow longer, Macy knew she wouldn't have time to talk to anyone about Scrap today. When Mr. Farrell drove home from the barber shop, the sun was setting behind a bank of clouds over the ocean. Macy held the door as the last of the ladies left, then called, "I'm going to look for that baby buggy, Mrs. Farrell." "Aunt Ida, dear," the woman corrected gently. "If the buggy is too high for you to reach, Uncle Emery will help you." Macy nodded. It was hard to think of them as aunt and uncle. Maybe that would be easier when she knew them better. "Take your coat," Aunt Ida reminded her. "It's getting cold outside." Macy shrugged into the cloth coat she left on the hook in the hall, thinking she didn't plan to be outside long enough to need it. Supper would be ready in a few minutes. Rain had begun to fall when she stepped into the garage, which had 3 sides but no doors. She stood still for a moment, listening to raindrops hitting the galvanized metal roof overhead. If she were home in Stanby, she could sit by the warm kitchen range while she sipped a cup of hot chocolate. Thoughts like that weren't helping. Shaking them away, she located the baby buggy, hanging from hooks on one wall. She had to climb onto a box to reach it, but managed to lift it down. Dust filtered from the rattan when she moved it. Maybe she should just set it in the rain for a few minutes to get it clean. As soon as the thought came to her, she pushed the buggy to the open end of the garage and outside into the rain. Across the gravel road, a beam of light shone from under one side of Mr. Oakes's blackout curtain. Uh-oh, his curtains are still not doing the trick. Hope you enjoyed. Stay tuned tomorrow for 2 more chapters. See ya.